Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? It's fantastic to be back in Louisiana. And as cold as it is today, I can promise you, it is colder in Granger, where my house is. In fact, my wife told me yesterday she couldn't get out of the driveway because it snowed. So anyway, I'll go back to that life in about a day or so. It's fantastic to be back. Christine tells people that if New Orleans was a woman, I would never have married her. And about 5 years ago, almost, I got an invitation from Professor John Cavadini, the director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life, to come up and be director of the Science of Religion Initiative. And after a few months of thinking about it, I went home and I told Christine, I said, I can't do this. I said, there's no way I can leave Louisiana. I said, I'm going to be 50 years old next summer. You're telling me the month I turn 50, I'm going to go take a new job 1,000 miles away in a place that's colder than, I didn't know it then, than Brian Kelly's conscience. Sorry, I'm sorry. And so, you know what my wife said to me? I once told Archbishop Hughes, I said, about 90% of my courage and initiative resides in my wife, and she lets me borrow it sometimes. She said, you mean you're going to tell Notre Dame no, and you haven't even brought me there to see it? And I'm Irish. She says, I'm a Kelly. I said, I love Notre Dame. I've never even been there. Oh, they fly you up there all the time, but I never get to go. So I said, what do you want to do? She said, let's take the Thanksgiving break. This is the fall of 2017. Let's take the Thanksgiving break and we'll just go up there and look at it. We'll just go see it. You can introduce me to these people that you work with. I haven't met most of them. And then we can look around. Maybe we'll look at a little real estate. We'll look at the schools. And we'll make a decision then. How about that? I'm like, all right. So we go up to Notre Dame. I go to the Notre Dame Navy game. This is like the Saturday before Thanksgiving. It was 40 degrees and dropping in that open air stadium, and it was raining. And I was dressed like a southeastern Louisiana idiot. By halftime, I bought a cup of hot chocolate so I could put my hands into it. It was like sitting there just trying to get the feeling back. And then I left. My son John, who I'm going to talk about a lot in this talk today, said, Dad, I'm not leaving. I'm staying until this game is over. I went back to the Airbnb and changed my clothes and just tried to get warm again. The next day we went to the Sacred Heart Basilica. How many of you have ever been to the University of Notre Dame? Raise your hand. Have you ever been in that? If you've been there, you've probably been in that extraordinary church. It was packed full of people. I had my back against the back wall of that church. I was actually separated from my other kids and from Christine and my youngest because we couldn't stand in the same place. And when the priest got up to preach the gospel, to proclaim the gospel, it was the parable of the talents. And Christine turned around and she went like this. So I rolled my eyes, which I do far too often when my wife talks truth to me. But anyway, I rolled my eyes, and then I just decided, I'm like, okay, God, I don't know why this is happening to me. And I felt like the Lord said at that moment during the offertory, take your beautiful Louisiana Catholic life and put it on the altar and open your hands and let me fill them. And we left church. I looked at Christine and said, all right, I might do it. Okay? And the rest, of course, is a very frozen history. All right. My talk today is not about anything like that. I just wanted to get that out of the way. My talk today is about how my earthly father loved me and how his love for me taught me how to love my sons, especially one of my sons. And at the end, I want to reflect on two attributes of God the Father that every son of the Father should think about all the time. Those attributes are justice and mercy. I'll get back to that. Many of the men here, if you hung around Catholic circles any time in the past 35 years, would probably know my dad, Richard Baglow, by sight. Because he and my mom, Melanie, were what I would call constant Catholics. Raise your hand if you ever met Richard Baglow. Yeah, a lot of you. Okay. But Dad was also, those of you who met him know this, one of the shyest and most quiet men you've ever met in your life. And he passed away on Ascension Thursday of May 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. I was able to get down. He had a cardiac event that was going to end his life in days. I was able to get down to be with him at his bedside, in the hospital overnight, and at his bedside as he died on Ascension Thursday. But to understand how he taught me about love and about the love of God the Father, I have to give you some background. First of all, my father chose 3 of the things that I love the most: my mother, Southeast Louisiana as his earthly home, and the Catholic Church as a spiritual home. I had all of those by birth, as many of you had. He had none of those by birth. He was born in the 1940s and grew up on Long Island, New York, in a town called New Hyde Park. His parents, John and Marjorie Baglow, were from England. My grandfather was from a coastal town called Biddeford on the western coast of England. My grandmother was from Sussex. They met in New York City, and they had 2 children, my Uncle Charlie, and then 13 years later, my dad. They were Presbyterian, English Presbyterians. I'd like you to meditate on that for a second. A loving family, but one that did things the English way. Stiff upper lips, modest in expressing love and emotion, and lightning quick wits. His whole childhood, they told my dad that he was the new car. In other words, my dad was not exactly what you might call a planned pregnancy. At any rate, my dad drew from that background a kind of a reluctance to express himself. In fact, once I became an adult, my dad stopped saying, "I love you" to me, because that's not something that English men say to men. And guess what? He never had to say it. I never doubted it for a moment, even in my worst moments when being my father had to have been a great burden for him to carry. I said my dad was quiet, but I think maybe a better word might be self-forgetful. 50% of what I know about his early life, I only know by asking him. The other 50% I only gathered from what he told my mom and from visits with my Uncle Charlie. By all accounts, that early life was amazing. My father contracted polio when he was 4. He was quarantined for months. We all know about quarantine now, right? But by the time he graduated from high school, he had a full athletic scholarship in track and field to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, an Ivy League school, where he majored in mathematics and where his distance relay record is still in the top 10. You can go check that out online. He set his personal record for the mile in 1962, 4 minutes, 6 seconds. One of my earliest memories is one visit we made. We only visited my grandmother in New York 3 times in my childhood. One of them was when I was young, about 4 or 5, going to her little house in Hampton Bays, New York, and walking into her living room, which looked like a trophy hall, was surrounded by trophies, many of which were taller than me. It didn't strike me then, but what strikes me now is that he did not bring any of those along with him into his adult life. He never looked back. His family was not religious, but I can't hear the words, "Then a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh." I can't hear those words and not think of my dad. When he married my mom, he entered a family that could not have been more different than his family of origin. A Southeast Louisiana, New Orleans, blue-collar French-German Catholic family, right? My grandmother and my grandfather had 6 children, and the family extended so far that well into my adulthood, in fact, even in my last year living here in Covington, Louisiana, I'd bump into people I was related to at Home Depot and not know their names. I can honestly say that I grew up in a family where more people loved me than their names that I knew. Right? That was an amazing gift. My grandfather was taken out of school to raise money for his family. This is my mother's father. He used to shine shoes on the steps of the courthouse on Tulane Avenue. After Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Navy. He was a machine gunner on a merchant ship in the South Seas, and he was a boxer in the Navy too. Sunday dinner, which we usually had at my grandmother's house, would be followed by at least an hour of my grandfather telling stories about that. And usually it was just my dad and I sitting there, listening the whole times to stories that we had heard over and over and over again. That was a sight. My Ivy League educated dad listening to my grandfather as if he was sitting at the feet of the Buddha. Only getting uncomfortable when my grandfather would start to cheer up, when Papa would start to tear up, which he would. Once he got telling stories, his emotions would overtake him. And my father, Richard, could not have been given a child more different than him when I was born. And I'm his first child and his only son. He loved mathematics. I hated it. He could never understand. He would try to help me for hours, and I just could not get it. Knocked me out of honors mathematics right away at Brother Martin High School. Went in honors, quickly was out. He was shy, as I said. I simply don't meet strangers. I'm so outgoing by nature that I will either be your friend or your enemy, right? You have no choice. He was patient. I'm irascible and quick to express myself. I learned my dad's English sense of humor, but I got none of his restraint, which has gotten me in trouble many, 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 many times. But the biggest difference between my dad and I was that I was a voracious reader and thinker from as soon as you taught me how to read. I was constantly asking questions. When I started doing faith and science work, which is what I do full-time now, my mother told me a story that one time in the drive-through line at the bank when I was about 6, I asked her, "Mom, if there was an Adam and Eve, what about Neanderthal man?" My dad did not have any interest in questions like those. I'm making it sound like we had nothing in common, but that's not exactly true. We both loved basketball and football. But what my father loved more than any sport was baseball. He grew up in New York during the 1950s and the Mickey Mantle era. And to this day, I hate baseball. To me, baseball is like dealing with the federal government. Let me explain. You wait, and then you wait, and then you wait, and then all of a sudden there's this explosion of dangerous activity. And then you wait, and you wait, and you wait. I just don't get it. But here's the takeaway about all that. Richard Baglow loved me exactly the way I was, and to a fault. My mom still tells me about how she would pull him aside and regale him with all of her worries about me. I think he and his friends are drinking. I think he might be smoking marijuana. I think he might have snuck out last night. By the way, sadly, all those things were actually true. My dad would listen and then say, "Don't worry, he's a good kid. He's a good kid." Well, I wasn't making good decisions, believe me. But he seemed to be in touch with some deeper goodness about me that I myself didn't even know about. It was his love for me and for my mother and my sisters, plus a couple of tragedies that struck my life as a teenager, plus an amazing priest by the name of Father Emile LaFrance. Some of you older men remember Father LaFrance? That made me rethink my life when I was 18 years old and decide to try and find God. That animated my decision to go to Franciscan University of Steubenville in 1986, which, by the way, I went because I knew it was a place where people drew close to God. When I got there, I saw that I had to take a religion class, a theology class. I remember thinking, I've been taking theology since I was in kindergarten, and most of it's been a waste of time. I will never study theology again after this class. I'm going to take it right away. December of 1986, that'll be the last theology class I ever take. Okay, well. By the way, Dad converted to Catholicism the following spring. So I entered Franciscan in the fall of '86. My dad became Catholic in 1987. He was brought into the church by Father Emile of France, who also died on Ascension Thursday, 25 years before my father. We always think about Father LaFrance, and at that time, waiting for my dad, waiting to bring him into heaven the same way he brought him into the church. I followed in my dad's footsteps 9 years after I went to Steubenville in '86 and 1995, and also married an amazing Catholic woman from a crazy New Orleans Catholic family, some of whom are here, so I won't say any more. But the important part of that story for today has to do with my oldest son, who was born in 2002. We wanted to name him Richard, but my dad asked if instead we had thought about naming him John Trevor, which was my grandfather's name. So my dad wanted it, I wanted it. I clinched the deal with my wife, Christine, who is a naming tyrant, by the way. I won't go into it. By pointing out that my dad never asked us for anything, right? And that we could honor St. John the Evangelist and St. John the Baptist in a single shot, and my own grandfather in a single naming. And she gave in. So that was the only time, though. The other four, I had plans, and she would dash them every time. John was born when we lived in Mandeville, Louisiana, in 2002. And a year later, I took a job at Our Lady of Holy Cross College in New Orleans. And I began what was the longest commute of my life. And I spent most of my career here crossing the causeway, all the way from Mandeville across the causeway, all the way through Metairie in the Central Business District, across the Crescent City Connection, and then deep into Algiers. I was always an hour and a half away, right? And that might be why I didn't see some things about my son that my wife saw early. I told you my father was a quiet man. My son was more quiet. In fact, he didn't really start talking until he was about 3.5 or 4. I thought, well, he's a boy. He has this precocious older sister who never shuts up. He just lets her talk for him. And that's all he needs. Well, Christine didn't see it that way. She was concerned. I was not. Margaret was the easiest child in the world to discipline. I mean, I could pretty much just reason with Margaret about things. You know what I mean? I can say, if you don't put that away and go take a bath, then, I'm not going to be able to read you a bedtime story. You're going to go straight to bed. Off she go, right? John was unresponsive. I just thought he was a boy. I mean, I was an unresponsive child. I figured he was an unresponsive child. But then as the years went on, we started worrying. And when he was almost 5 years old, Christine brought him for an evaluation, and we discovered that we had an autistic son. How many of you ever seen the national symbol for autism? It's a puzzle. It's a puzzle. Nothing could better express what it was like to have an admittedly high-functioning autistic child as my first son. I grew up in a family of all girls. I was so excited about having this son. And one of the temptations of a father is this. You want to realize everything that you never were and plenty of the things that you were through your boy, right? And I couldn't even talk to my boy. In fact, I couldn't even get him to look me in the eyes. He was extremely difficult to discipline. Everything that I had in my arsenal that I had thought out for when I raised my daughter and never really ever had to use, I pulled out with John. And it never made anything better. It always made things worse. Always made things worse. I'm like, wow, parenting boys is really tough. Christine is watching, and she knows it's not just that. So when she comes home and tells me about the autism diagnosis, you know what I said? I said, that can't be true. He's just a boy. This is the way boys are. Boys are crazy. They're impulsive. Boys don't listen. Right? And she said, I think it's more than that. And I just kept on going straight forward, trying to parent my son the way I thought all boys should be parented, as if there was some kind of cookie cutter in heaven for boys. I'll never forget the day that Christine pulled me aside and gave me my Come to Jesus talk about this. She looked at me and she said, I want you to listen to me. See that? Always pointing, right? Just like in the basilica. I want you to listen to me. She said, I know how much you have wanted a son. You have talked about it our entire marriage. But this son that God has given you is not necessarily the son that you would design him to be. You need to let him show you who he is. So I said, okay. Now at this time, we were living in Metairie. We had moved, and Katrina had flooded our house 5 weeks after we got into it. I see Johnny DeMello right there who helped us fix that problem. Anyway, it was a difficult time. A lot of things were going on. I had taken on this project for a school in Mobile, Alabama, to write a book on faith and science. I had no qualifications to write, which ended up changing the whole course of my career, but I didn't know that at the time. I said, okay, that's it. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to throw all this away. All the parenting tips and techniques I thought would help me raise my son the right way. I'm just setting it aside. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to watch and listen. I'm going to watch him and listen to him. I'm going to let him be the person that he is. And then I'm going to find a way not to react, but to respond. About a month or two later, my sister, who's far more financially successful than I, got a trip to Disney World for a convention for her work. And she invited me and my mom and my dad and my son to join her and her son in Disney World. And so I said, okay, this is going to be an opportunity for me, just me and John, for me to change what I'm doing. And so we went. It was John's first airplane ride. That was amazing to him. And of course, Disney World is an amazing place, right? We go, we spend time. We have his birthday is there, his 5th birthday while we're there. We have a big party for him at one of these restaurants. And as we're walking across, I remember it was at Disney Studios, we're walking to get on the bus. And my son says, "Thank you, Dad." Just out of the blue. And I said, "Yeah, it was a great party, huh, John? That was great." And he said, "No, thank you for giving me the attention that I need." A complete sentence. His mother wasn't there to coach him. It was this complete sentence. That boy is now 20 years old. He's a sophomore at Holy Cross College in South Bend, Indiana, right across the street from Notre Dame. By the time he was a senior in high school, he had discovered, or actually early on in high school at St. Paul's, he discovered a love for the stage, for theater. His last semester in high school, he had the lead role in The Music Man. Here's my non-expressive son singing and dancing in front of huge audience. Okay? He won his community service award and he was on the homecoming court. This is a boy who had to leave his high school that he loved, St. Paul's in Covington, the end of his sophomore year, right? And go to a brand new school, St. Joseph High School in South Bend, where he knew no one. Okay? That little decision to love him as he is, to follow my father's example and find the deepest truth about him, and to focus on that, that was the greatest decision I could have ever possibly made. And it was not easy. And to this day, it's not easy. Yesterday, I left South Bend. He's home for spring break right now at the house. I left South Bend, and I forgot to buy a bag of dog food for our 2 dogs. right? And we were at the bottom when I fed him, when I left to drive to Chicago on Thursday morning. John, my son Peter calls me, says, Dad, the dogs are going to starve to death. You know, I'm like, so I text John, I'm like, John, run over to the store and buy a bag of dog food and I'll pay you back. I'll transfer some money into your account, right? Well, one of the things about autistic folks is that the professionals call it perseverate. Like they think about the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. 3 times last night after he bought that bag of dog food, he was in touch with me. Dad, did you transfer the money? Dad, did you transfer the money? Dad, did you transfer the money? Then he calls me. He calls me as I'm driving back from the dinner with Danny Abramowitz and the crowd. I'm like, John, I was at dinner and now I'm driving. When I get to the house, I'll transfer the money. You know, that kind of thing. Still learning how to love him. But that's something that's true whether your child has autism or not. You're always learning to love them. And love always involves 2 things: justice and mercy. I want to read you this quote from St. Thomas Aquinas. I encountered it when I was writing my doctoral dissertation on his biblical commentaries. He wrote these incredible commentaries on Scripture. Most people have heard of the Summa Theologiae, but they haven't heard of his commentary on Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, Paul says, God, who is rich in mercy, right? While we were dead in our sins, quickened us together in Christ, literally brought us back to life out of sin. And this is his commentary on that. It's about justice and mercy. I'll say a little bit about it, and then I'm going to conclude. He said in this commentary that he wrote in about the 1250s AD, when a person's love is caused by the goodness of the one he loves, then that person loves out of justice. It is just that he loves such a person. When, however, love causes goodness in the beloved, then it is a love springing from mercy. The love with which God loves us produces goodness in us. Hence, mercy is the root of divine love. Let's think about that for a second. When I was 15 years old, I saw Mother Teresa in the UNO Lakefront Arena. And even though I was not a religious kid, or really very much interested in even going to church, when everybody stood up, I stood up and applauded her. That was an act of justice. A woman who has done such great good as that, she should be honored that way. I wasn't being merciful to Mother Teresa. I was being just to Mother Teresa. When I actually put down the opportunities to make a little extra cash or do a little extra work so I could take it easier at the office the next day, and I just spend time with my children doing the things they want to do, I would say that's an act of justice. I brought them into this world. It is just for me to love them that way. But, and I'm not saying it's an either or here, it's both and. Both and. There are many times when your children need your mercy, where they need to be loved in such a way that that love produces goodness in them, right? Causes it. That was the great gift of Richard Baglow in my life. No matter what I did, he found a way to cause goodness in me. He found a way to find that goodness and build on goodness, even when I didn't deserve it, and he knew it. Because all he was telling my mother, he's a good kid. He knew every single thing, and what I was doing that was wrong, right? Justice and mercy are always together in God's love for us, right? But the root of that love is mercy. To love someone in such a way that you produce goodness in them. To love someone in such a way that they can reach new heights precisely because of the way you've loved them. That is the gift of fatherhood. One of the interesting things about the church's teaching on creation, which I talk a lot about because of the relationship between faith and science and how important that is that it wasn't 13.5 billion years ago that God said, "Let there be light." It wasn't 13.5 billion years ago when God said, and creation was made. No, it was 13.5 billion years ago, and it's right now too. Right now, God is holding us in existence out of nothing. Right now, God is saying, "Let there be light. Let us make man in our image after our likeness." God's love for us is first and always mercy, because you don't owe anything to nothing. And if he's causing us to exist out of nothing right now, that means that the very fact that we can breathe at this moment is because of mercy. The cross of Christ is the meaning of the universe. That's why I do faith and science work. I want everybody to see that. I want every neuroscience major to know that. Every biochem major to hear that. That's my work at Notre Dame. Right? That's the truth about the God who loves us as sons of the Father. Thank you very much.